This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so we're diving deep today into how Japan kind of dragged the U.S. into World War II. And, going through the sources you guys gave us, wow, it's pretty intense stuff. It's kind of like watching, one of those slow motion train wrecks. You can see it coming, but nobody can do anything to stop it.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating period, and you're right about that sense of inevitability. It's almost tragic how it all unfolds.
So, okay, let's set the scene for our listeners. We're talking late 1930s. America's still struggling to get back on its feet after the Depression. And the memories of World War I, those are still very, very fresh, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Isolationism, that was the overwhelming sentiment in America. I mean, they passed the Neutrality Acts in the mid-30s, actually made it illegal to sell weapons to any country at war. That shows you just how much people wanted to stay out of anything going on overseas.
So Americans are looking inward, trying to rebuild. And meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Japan's making some pretty aggressive moves. 1931, they invade Manchuria, and then boom, 1937, a full-scale invasion of China. Did that not set off any alarms here in the U.S.?
Oh, it did, definitely. But, President Roosevelt was in a really tricky situation. You had all these concerning reports coming from Asia, but at home, people were demanding that he focus on the Depression. I mean, try telling someone who's struggling to feed their family that they need to worry about a war, halfway around the globe.
Yeah, that's a tough sell. So what did Roosevelt do? How did he respond to Japan's, well, basically their expansion?
Well, his initial approach was a kind of cautious mix of diplomacy and economic pressure. He condemned Japan's actions, for sure, but he didn't want to poke the bear too hard, so to speak. And got to remember, the U.S. military back then was, well, shockingly unprepared for a major conflict. Ranked 18th in the world in size.
18th.
Yeah, actually smaller than Romania. It's hard to believe, right?
Wow, I had no idea it was that bad. Okay, so walk us through some of those early moves that Roosevelt made.
Sure. Well, one event that really stands out is the quarantine speech he gave in '37. In it, he called for basically a quarantine of aggressor nations, including Japan.
Mm-hmm.
It was subtle, but it was a definite shift away from strict isolationism. You could say he was kind of, testing the waters of public opinion.
Okay. And how'd that go over? How'd people react?
Not well. A lot of pushback from the isolationists in Congress and from the public, too. They saw it as a risky move, a step towards getting involved in something we had no business in. Really shows you how strong the isolationist feeling was at the time.
So it sounds like Roosevelt's walking this really, really fine line, trying to address this threat from Japan, but without, upsetting a huge chunk of the American people.
Exactly, yeah. And as Japan's getting cozier with the Axis powers, Germany and Italy, and they're pushing deeper into French Indochina, well, Roosevelt knew he had to do something more. He started slapping economic sanctions on Japan, cutting off important exports like scrap metal, but the real gut punch, that was the oil embargo.
Cutting off their oil, that must, really hurt them, right?
Oh, absolutely. Japan was almost totally reliant on oil imports, especially from the U.S. It was the fuel, literally, for their military.
Yeah.
And Roosevelt knew this was a risky move. It could either force Japan to back down or, well, provoke them into doing something desperate.
So Roosevelt's basically playing chicken with Japan, trying to squeeze them with these sanctions, but at the same time, hoping to avoid a war that, honestly, the U.S. just wasn't ready for. And, well, I guess we all know how that gamble turned out. Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, it's really one of those, what-if moments in history. What if America had been better prepared? What if they'd taken a tougher stance earlier? These are questions historians have been wrestling with for decades.
Yeah, it's easy to look back now and judge. But back then, could they really have known what Japan was going to do? Even U.S. intelligence, they were totally blindsided by the Pearl Harbor attack, right?
Exactly. Nobody expected Japan to launch an attack, a surprise attack like that,
Right.
thousands of miles from their own territory. But this whole failure to understand what Japan was really up to, it goes beyond just misjudging the location. There were some pretty fundamental miscalculations at play here.
Okay, so let's talk about that. How could the U.S. underestimate Japan so badly? They were clearly a rising power. They had a powerful military.
Well, one factor that we can't ignore, and it's a tough one to talk about, is racial prejudice. It's an uncomfortable truth, but back then there was widespread racial bias in the U.S. that led a lot of people to see Japan as, well, inferior technologically and industrially.
So they just assumed Japan couldn't pull off a sophisticated attack like Pearl Harbor.
There was this idea floating around that Japan could only make, cheap knockoffs of Western technology. They completely missed Japan's real military capabilities and their willingness to fight a war on a global scale.
It's a pretty stark reminder of how prejudice can really warp people's judgment and lead to, well, really terrible outcomes. Were there other factors that contributed to this miscalculation?
Well, don't forget the world was on the edge of a much bigger war in Europe. I mean, the threat of Nazi Germany, that was taking up most of Roosevelt's attention.
So Japan was seen as like a sideshow almost, a regional problem, not really a direct threat to the U.S.
Exactly. The main focus was on stopping Hitler. Japan was kind of seen as, well, a distraction from that bigger goal.
So you've got this tunnel vision, you've got racial prejudice, and you've got a military that's, as we said, totally unprepared. I mean, it's almost like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it really is. It's a perfect storm of miscalculations and missed opportunities. And the results, well, we all know how tragic they were. Over 2,400 Americans killed at Pearl Harbor. And the U.S. was, well, suddenly and violently pulled into World War II.
Yeah, there's no question. Pearl Harbor, it just completely shattered that isolationist mood in America. It's the thing that finally forced them into a war that they had spent years trying to steer out of.
It's amazing how quickly the national mood shifted. I mean, practically overnight, isolationism just vanished, and in its place, you saw this surge of patriotism and this determination to defeat the Axis.
It's incredible how one single event can change the course of history so drastically, and it raises the question: how much blame should Roosevelt shoulder for not doing more to prevent this?
That's where the historical debate gets really interesting. Was he too cautious? Was he too held back by all that isolationist sentiment in the U.S.? Or was he actually a really skilled politician navigating a really, really tricky situation, making the best choices he could with the few options he had?
It sounds like there's no easy answer.
There really isn't. Historians have been going back and forth about Roosevelt's role for years and years. Some historians, like Robert Dallek, they argue that Roosevelt's cautious approach was actually strategic, that he understood how deeply isolationist America was, and he knew he couldn't push public opinion too hard, too fast.
So Dalek's saying Roosevelt was playing the long game, using the sanctions to kind of keep Japan in check while buying time to prepare the U.S. for a possible war.
Yeah, that's the idea. But then you've got other historians like Michael Simpson who suggest that Roosevelt, at heart, he was an internationalist. He understood the danger that Japan posed to democracy worldwide, and he wanted to do more. But he was stuck. He was hamstrung by all that isolationist sentiment in the U.S.
So Simpson's saying that Roosevelt's hands were tied, that even if he personally wanted to get tougher with Japan earlier, the political climate in America just wouldn't let him.
That's the heart of the debate. Was Roosevelt a clever strategist playing this delicate diplomatic game, or was he a reluctant warrior who was basically, forced into action by events that were spinning out of control?
It's a fascinating question, and it really shows you just how complex historical analysis can be. There's rarely a clear-cut black and white answer. Yeah, it really makes you think, about the weight of those decisions that leaders have to make and how they affect people for generations. It's kind of like that saying, the past is never dead. It's not even past. And in this case, the past is still shaping how we see America's place in the world.
It's a good point. It reminds us that history isn't just about, dates and battles and all that. It's about choices. The choices people made, and then what happened because of those choices.
Mm-hmm.
And as we've seen, those choices are often influenced by really complicated things like domestic politics and social attitudes and what's going on in the rest of the world.
Yeah, it's also kind of interesting to imagine how things could have been different. If just one thing had changed. What if the U.S. military had been stronger? What if they hadn't been so blinded by prejudice? When they were trying to figure out what Japan was capable of.
Those are the kind of questions that historians love to grapple with, and obviously we can't go back and change what happened. But thinking about those what ifs, it helps us understand just how messy decision making can be, and how many different things can shape historical events.
It also shows you how important it is to think critically, to question your own assumptions, right? Because as we've seen, even really deep-seated beliefs like that isolationist feeling that was so strong in America, those beliefs can change really dramatically when something big happens.
No question about it. And the things we learn from history, those lessons can help us deal with the problems we're facing today, right? By understanding the mistakes and the bad calls that people made in the past. Well, hopefully we can avoid making those same mistakes, down the road.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what's the main takeaway for you? What do you hope our listeners will remember from this whole exploration of how Japan pulled America into World War II?
Well, for me, it's the reminder that we're all connected in ways that we might not always realize. Actions have consequences, and even things that seem far away, they can have a huge impact on our lives. It's a lesson in humility, in realizing that we don't know everything, and in appreciating just how complicated history really is.
I like that. Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for coming along with us on this journey through this really crucial moment in history. It's a story full of intrigue and missteps and ultimately tragedy, but it's also a story that gives us some really valuable insights into human nature and how political decisions are made, and the fact that the past never really goes away.
It's been great digging into this with you. I hope our listeners have enjoyed it,
Yeah.
and that it's given them something to think about.
And for anyone who wants to learn even more about this period, we've put together some great resources in the show notes. Make sure to check those out. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those deep dives going.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.